Well, if you're all ready, let's get started. So today the topic is multi-echo fMRI, which is a slightly different way of doing things. So hopefully I'm going to walk you a little bit about what multi-echo fMRI is, so you understand what the data looks like, a couple of the basic things that you might want to do so you have some multi-echo data. Maybe those things are not the things that you really would want to do, but will help you understand, a little bit more the data and what's on it. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about MICA, which is a way to denoise automatically denoise multi-echo data, and multi-echo SPFM, which is a way to do the convolution of events also based on multi-echo data. So before I move any forward, in case you need some extra information about any of those topics, of course, feel free to send me an email. But if you want to do a little bit more of reading, maybe those are two good resources. The first one has to do more with just a simple introduction to multi-echo and MICA, and the second one more with the last part of the talk, the convolution methods. And please stop me at any moments if you have any questions, and please use the microphone so your question can be understood in the recordings. So what is multi-echo fMRI? So let's start thinking about what your regular single echo fMRI is. So in single echo fMRI, what we do is that during a given TR, we acquire data over time, and within a given TR, we acquire a volume of data, one slice at a time. That data is acquired at a given echo time, hopefully selected as to maximize ball contrast on average across all gray matter. And when you do that across time, at the end of the day, what you end up is with time series per voxel. And that's what you input into your preprocessing and then your statistics and get your wonderful connectivity or activity maps. In multi-echo fMRI, what's going to happen is that we want to acquire almost at the same time 3 or more time series per voxel. We're going to acquire for every slide 3 versions of it, each of them at a different echo time. This is not to be confused with multiband. When you do multiband, what you do is you acquire several slices, different ones, consecutively, so you can accelerate your acquisition. Here, what you're going to do is to acquire the data at different echo times, which is going to kind of play with the contributions of different types of signal to each of your time series. You do that across time, and basically when you end up is with several time series per voxel, okay? So you don't scan faster, you get more data. And we're gonna see what we can do with all this extra data that we get. Initially, the idea is that we get this extra set of information, these several time series, usually 3, although sometimes there are some data sets there with 4 or even 5 echoes, and you do this at no SAR cost because there are not additional excitation pulses. A slight loss in temporal resolution because you need extra time to acquire those additional echo times, but the truth is that if you combine multi-echo and multiband, that's no longer a problem, and multi-echo multiband sequences do exist. And then maybe you could argue that there is a slight loss in spatial resolution because you want to ensure there is enough signal on the latest echoes, but truly, I mean, you can almost acquire your data equivalently in terms of TR spatial resolution to what would be your single echo fMRI and have all this additional information these days. So, as I said, you're going to be getting several time series per voxel, therefore several volumes. Here we're looking just a single data point, the 3 different echoes, and the first thing we can see is that the shortest echoes are going to help us to recover signal in areas in which normally we have a lot of dropout. So as I move through the presentation, always think at the second echo as your equivalent to single echo fMRI, because usually this echo is around the same echo time that the data that you would acquire having a single echo scheme. And as you can see here, we almost have no signal, the same here, but we recover it on the first echo. And then we're going to find ways in which maybe we can combine all this data to come with what would be an optimal way of analyzing it. But before we can do all that, I'm going to have to walk you a little bit through a couple of formulas so we understand what the signal is. I'm trying to do it the more intuitive way, so please don't look too much at the formulas and try to listen at what I'm explaining. So here what we have is just a single volume, few voxels, and the time series for all these voxels. And the way to model the signal at a given position and at a given moment on time and at one of those many echoes is to think of it as having 2 components here plus the noise. The first component is here S0 and depends on the position and the time and captures local fluctuations due to T1 changes, hardware instability, kind of, the things we don't like. And then we have here in the exponential a second component that depends on position and time, but as you can see, it's multiplied by the echo time, and we'll see how this is important later, that captures fluctuations in field inhomogeneity, which includes Ball fluctuation, which basically includes the changes in the signal that are somehow related to neuronal activation. And we're going to think of each of those components, the S0 and the R2 star, as having both a mean value across time and then a little fluctuation sitting on top, okay? This is the mean value, okay. This is the mean value for S0 and the little fluctuation sitting on top. This is the mean value for the R2 star and the little fluctuation sitting on top. And because of that, basically the fluctuation, it's going to be much smaller than that mean value, okay? That's the way we define it. So now that we have that, let's start thinking about things that we can do, okay? So the first thing that we could do is to try to compute the static maps of S0 and T2 star or R2 star. Here are the little formulas, so we have them, the ones I just showed you. So how do we do that? So, okay, so by definition, because the way we define it, delta S0 and delta R2 star have zero mean because we took the mean out, okay? And if knowing that, what happens is that the signal, the average signal across time at a given voxel and for a given echo can be written this way, okay, where it depends on the mean S0 and the mean R2 star. So just if you take the average of your signal in every single voxel, you know, that signal basically follows this model. If we were to take the logs in both parts of that, and we were to basically expand it, what we see is that we end up with a very simple linear system that we can try to solve. Where we have this known, this is what we measure at the different echoes. We know the different echoes, and we can try to solve both for the static map of R2 star and the static map of S0. If we were to do that, this is an example. So here we have the static S0 map, and we can see that it captures things like the signal inhomogeneity that you usually see when you use multi-coil imaging. If we look at the R2 star map, or sorry, the T2 star map, we can start to see things like, for example, that the T2 star in the ventricles, it's much higher than the T2 star on the gray matter and white matter. And this is going to be interesting because then this is something that we're going to use later in other steps. That's why it's good to get those things out of the data. Another thing that we can try to do, although I don't recommend it because it's a very noisy procedure, is to actually try to extract time series of the small S0 fluctuation and the small R2 star or T2 star fluctuation. In order to do that, here is our original formulation where we have the signal at a given voxel time and echo time. And all I've done here is to basically input these two formulas. So I have expanded this into this here, and I have expanded this part here into this inside the exponential, okay? If we move things around a little bit, we can write it down this way, just simple mathematics here. Starts to look closer to something that maybe we can separate components, but it's far from it. We can use a first order Taylor expansion for the exponential, the term here, I'm substituted for this. This is an approximation, but it's okay to do this one here. Now we have a system in which, you know, everything seems to be linear, but still we have some multiplication of the two terms that we're interested. Because these two things are very small and are actually being divided by one of the big things, this term, we can assume it's much smaller than this or any other terms within the big brackets. And that's why another step of the approximation, we can take it out. We get a simpler version here. And if we do a little bit of renaming and we could delta rho, basically there's not fluctuation divided by its mean, this guy here. And we define delta kappa as the R2 star fluctuation multiplied by the average of all your echo times. We come to a formulation that should we move this to this side, basically what we will have is the signal that we measure in a given voxel in terms of signal percent change, the signal minus the mean divided by the mean, is the linear combination of the non-Ball fluctuations and the Ball fluctuations, with the Ball fluctuations multiplying by the echo time, okay? So again, we have a linear system. We can try to solve this, and again here, just as an example, we have the time series for several voxels within this region. This is the original signal for a given echo, the middle echo. So we do this and try to extract the delta R2 star fluctuations. What we can see in this voxel, it seems it works because initially, you know, those very slow drifts tend to be artifacts. So it seems that it was good at capturing the good stuff and getting rid of that. But we can see it doesn't happen everywhere. There are a few voxels here where this didn't work, and it's because the way the system of equations is set up, any little noise, anything that doesn't really match, it will get amplified. And here is what you get should you do this for the S node. And again, in these voxels, clearly it captures the drift, but it's not something you might want to do. There are better ways to do, like mica and other things. But here is an example. If we do that and we try to run Instacore, which basically means trying to get the correlation of a given voxel to the rest of the brain on the original data, here we have a map that doesn't really look that great because it looks like there is connectivity only to one side of the brain. We see these stripes, so that's because the data, it's kind of noisy, it's not perfect yet. If we do that, the same thing on the S node, it seems it captures these problems that I was describing, but then if we do it on the R2 star time series, we start to get something that resembles more what the network should be. Now, that's two things we can do. Another one, and this is something that we tend to do now, and moving forward to what's really the type of things that you should be doing with your data, is that we have several time series per voxel. Now we can do the simple thing is like, let's average them together. And this is something you can do, and come with a single time series that at least it should take care of anything that is random noise across all of them. But that's the only thing that you're going to eliminate. And you're not going to really take advantage of anything we know about how these different signals have different amounts of ball weighting on them. So long time ago, somebody developed a better weighting algorithm, just a weighted average of the different echoes, but in a little bit of more smart way that allows you to maximize the CNR while also recovering the signal in the affected regions by dropout. So if you were to do just the simple thing of combining the signals, you should always try to do this instead of just the simple averaging. And here is an example where we have single echo one volume, how it looks. This is an example of the same volume, but after doing this weighted average, and you can start to see how we have recovered a little bit of signal here as compared to here. But remember, because when we're doing fMRI, what we really care is about fluctuations across time. Just that the static image looks better doesn't mean we got better data. So looking at things like temporal signal to noise ratio might be a better way to think about this. And if we were to look at TSNR maps of the middle echo compared with the optimally combined echo, we can see very clearly how we have improved in these regions where we had dropout. Okay, everything clear so far? Okay, so the last step of these little things that we need to understand before we move to the two more advanced ways of dealing with multi-echo data is this idea of echo dependence analysis. So again, let's come back to our very simple formulation of the signal at a given voxel, given moment in time, and a given echo time is given by this formula. And let's assume, let's put values on this. So let's assume that at a given moment, at a given voxel, S naught has a value of 5,000 and T2 star 30 milliseconds. Okay, those are regular values. What you would get, so you plot this as a function of echo time, is a decay curve like this. Now let's assume there is activation, meaning there's only a change on the T2 star part, on the R2 star part. By the way, I didn't say it, but R2 star is simply 1 divided by T2 star. One is the inverse of the other, that's all. What we would see is a second curve that behaves like this. So this is the original one, and this is after a little change on T2 star, which is basically what it happens when you have neuronal activation. If we get the subtraction of these two, we get this type of profile of the different signal versus echo time. And this is the type of curves in which you would use to decide what is your optimal echo time. You want to maximize the signal change for a given change in T2 star, and this would be basically, the echo time that would be the optimal for this particular voxel with a particular type of tissue. But if we think of this curve in terms of signal percent change, which is basically that difference divided by the average across time, what we can see is that for ball-like fluctuations, for fluctuations that are due to a change in T2 star, there is a linear dependent on the signal level in terms of signal percent change, okay? This is key for what we're gonna call the echo dependence analysis. So basically, signal fluctuations that are due to a change in R2 star or T2 star end up showing as having a linear dependence in terms of echo time when you think of the signal as signal percent change. The signal minus the mean divided by the mean. Now, let's look at the same curves, But this time, let's leave this guy constant and then just do a little change on S0 because there is motion or there is T1 effect or some hardware instability. What we could get is these two curves. As you can see, they're different to these two. If we think of them in terms of the difference between them, the profile that we get across echo times is very different to this one. And in terms of signal percent change, what we get is a flat line. So basically, ball-like fluctuations have a linear dependence with echo time, and non-ball fluctuations don't show that linear dependence with echo time. And this is basically the key of everything else that I'm going to show moving forward. Does this make sense? Okay. So what can we do with this? Okay, let's start thinking about some more interesting things. So first of all, we need to have multi-echo data. Okay, if you have single echo data, this is just for fun, but you cannot apply these techniques. So first thing you can do is start acquiring multi-echo data, which, as I said, I think it buys you a lot. If you don't want all that it buys you, you can always use the middle echo as a first step to see what's in your data, and then take it forward from there. But so you have some multi-echo data, like here, with 3 echoes, because now we have this idea about how the signals behave. Let's say we have, for example, in a given experiment, we've done a block design, visual experiment, and we know that there should be some signal in there that should behave in this manner because we impose this block paradigm with, 20 seconds of flashing checkerboard, 40 seconds of nothing. Well, the way we can take advantage of this, we could say, okay, we can take this signal and look for the fit of this signal in every single voxel across the 3 echoes. And if we do that here, we see it was really a visual experiment, and we can see that it tends to fit visual cortex, and it looks like there is this linear dependence in which it fits differently across the different echoes. In order to quantify that, so we can do something more, the next thing that we can do is to actually see how well in each of the voxels the model fits, the data fits this linear dependence or this nonlinear dependence. And if we do that, and then kind of average across all voxels for a given signal, we can come with 2 metrics that tell us a little bit in average, what we call kappa and rho, how much this particular signal components appears in the data following the behavior that something that is ball-like should follow, or following the behavior that something that is non-ball-like should follow. And looking at these numbers, we could argue that initially it looks like this is a ball-like component, that signals appear in the data following the profile of something that is ball-like should. That makes sense? Okay, so the problem is that we don't always know what types of signals to look for. Imagine resting state, or even imagine during tasks, we know there is a lot of artifacts in our data, but we don't really know what's their shape. So what can we do? That's where, MICA comes into place. So what is MICA and how it works from a very high level point of view? So the idea here is basically we're going to have multi-echo data. We have our model of how the data behaves, and we're basically going to use ICA to decompose the original data and look for signals that are present. So then we're going to be able to apply something similar to what I just described to decide whether those signals are signals that are of interest, they're ball-like, and therefore I should keep them and maybe look at them in my analysis, or they don't behave like ball, and therefore I should remove them because most likely they're artifacts and noise. And if you do this, here is an example. You run ICA on your data. The way we tend to do this, we first do that optimal combination that I just described, in which we combine all the echoes with that weighted average, and then we run ICA on that single time series, give us all these different components, and then we go one by one doing the analysis that I just mentioned. So here is one component, the time course. This is the fit to the different echoes. You get the F maps, and then you do the weighted average, and you get a kappa and rho. And it looks like it makes sense. This looks like a slow fluctuations. It looks like it fits the maps in a way that is anatomically valid, and it gives us a kappa that is much higher than the rho, which would lead to thinking that this is a good component that we should keep in our analysis. Yes? Can you use the microphone, please?
So the SEA is performed after...
The what?
The SEA analysis is performed after OC, right?
Yes.
So how do you compute the 3 components, spatial maps?
So you do the optimal combination, you run the ICA, and then you get you get your 30 components, 40 components, okay? Each of them you have a map and a time series. Now you take the time series and you fit it against the independent echoes right before the optimal combination. So the optimal combination enters the ICA. But then to get back here, you take the time series of a given component and you try to fit it against each of the independent echoes. That makes sense? Okay. So here is an example of another component that looks like noise. I mean, we can see it's a higher frequency fluctuation. We can say the way it fits the different echoes looks like, this type of ring around the brain, which usually signals motion. And we can see that it fits all of them around the same intensity. When we do the business that I just described, we come with a rho being much higher than kappa, okay? Again, also, you see, it's not like kappa is 0 and rho is 1,000, okay? There are some components in which there is a very clear decision to make. There will be other components that might not be that clear, okay? So if we were to do this in our data, this is the original paper by Prantik Kundu where he described the method. When you do an ICA components are usually sorted in terms of their variance explained. And so here is, the components are sorted by variance. And we can see is that, and this is their kappa. There is not really a relationship between kappa and variance. I mean, this is another way of looking at the components and taking a decision, not simply based on the variance. If we were to sort them, in this case by the kappa value, what we can see is there is this plot in which there is this kind of elbow. And if we were to do this with many different data sets, we would see that that's a behavior that seems to happen all the time. Now, it happens all the time. We have a few components that seems to have much higher kappas than everybody else, and then at a given point, they're all very low and they're more stable. Now, that being said, it's not an easy business to decide where to put the cut, okay? And this is something that's going to cause some problems and sometimes may make the algorithm not to behave perfectly. But if we were to look at the components that are up here, we would see that they all look like components that you would want to keep in your data, your regular resting state networks. I don't know, the full mode network, you name it. If we were to look at the other side of the spectrum, the ones that are after this elbow that somehow we have to decide, well, we can see that we have on the other side, the things with the very low kappa are the artifacts. And we can see them both by the time series, high frequency fluctuations, or these big jumps like in here, but also by the way their spatial maps are. And Prantik did this on 3T data, 7T data, and this overall behavior is always present on your data. And what I'm trying to say with this slide, that this is not just particular to 3T. You can use these methods at all your scanners. So with this in mind, I'm gonna next try to give you a little bit of an overview of what MICA does beginning to end, but I'm not gonna be able to go in all the details, okay? So it's just a little bit overview of how it works. Everything clear so far? Okay. So the first thing you need to do is to pre-process your data a little bit, and there are many different things you could do. If you wanna talk to us, both either me or Dan or people in the AFNI group about what's the best pre-processing to do, we're happy to do so. Unfortunately, I cannot give you guidelines, or this is exactly what you need to do. But to a minimum, you wanna do a slice timing correction, head motion correction. I would argue maybe you don't want to do filtering because that would allow you to then, when you're looking at your components, really see whether you have some of them that have high frequency, and if you have cut it before, that might not be that easy, and you might want to do your registration and do all this business on either, a final M&I space, or you can do it on the original and, pick your poison. Then you're going to do the optimal combination. Yeah, go ahead.
Just say loud. So what are the sources of the S0 changes?
So you have inflow effects, you have hardware instabilities, things like that. In general, everything that is not, you wouldn't want it on your data.
How about the changes due to the respiration?
So respiration is a tricky one. Okay, so let me answer your question the other way around, which is not everything that is bold, it's something you want. Because the bold components will include everything you want, but will also include some physiological noise. In the case of respiration, it has different components. Some of them end up on the S0 because there is motion associated with it, and some of it end up on the R2 star. That answers your question?
Yeah.
So, it's totally valid as part of this pre-processing to do physiological noise correction first, definitely. And you can do it either because with retro-IC or RBT, so you have external measures of physiology, or you can do something like CompCore to try to get those out of the signal in your ventricles. Then we're gonna do optimal combination, so then we can run the ICA on it. That's the way the algorithm works right now, but nothing would preclude us from doing the ICA concatenating all the echoes in a single matrix, and that's one of the many things that we've been looking at. The first thing you do usually, always it's a PCA, because in order for the ICA to actually convert, it's good that it doesn't have too much Gaussian noise, so the PCA just allows you to do a little bit of dimensionality reduction and get rid of the noise. PCA, well, I will go that into a second on the details of that. Then there is the independent components analysis, the selection of the components that are bad, the removal, and and Mica will give you a single output time series that's where you're going to follow your analysis, okay? It can also give you one of the latest versions, because there are several out there. It can also give you the noise version of each of the echoes, which might come handy, for example, for the second type of analysis that I'm going to describe. So it depends why you're doing filtering. Let's say you're doing filtering just to get rid of physiological noise, because you have super well sample data, and there is no overlap, and you could do. Well, I mean, you can do it first, and that should be fine. I said about not doing it because initially I like when I look at my components, because I don't trust the algorithm fully, and I want to sometimes evaluate whether the algorithm makes some mistakes. Seeing the high frequency components in the time series helps me a lot. You could, and this, I don't know if there is any AFNI person here, but they're working on AFNI Proc Pi, integrating this into that. So one thing you can do is you run all this without having done your filtering. You get your time series that are bad. You also have your other regressors like due to motion and a couple other things. And then on the actual final, what's the program? A 3D feeder done? Where you're gonna remove all those components, you can actually do the filtering by feeding all these sines and cosines. So there are different ways to do it. So let's move into the next one. So about the PCA, so just a single word here. Usually when you do PCA and you select component based on their variance, and you keep the ones with the highest variance with the idea that those are signal and everything else is noise. The way the algorithm was designed initially is that you want to keep things that are signal meaning good signal or bad signal, and in order to do that, the way the algorithm works, it basically keeps everything that has a high kappa or a high rho, and then moves forward. That's the only slight difference on how you would do a regular PCA and how the way it's done in Mica. And then for the ICA part, it uses fast ICA. And then after it has done that, it starts doing the component characterization. Basically, for each component, it's going to not only calculate the kappa and the rho, which is what we tend to always explain, but a long list of other characteristics. And then there is a decision tree, mostly empirically based, that takes a decision based on all these characteristics of those components. And different versions of Mica deal with that in different ways. The kappa and the rho are the most obvious, but it's also going to look at variance explained. In general, artifacts seems to have a lot of variance. Now, you wouldn't want to look just at the variance explained, because if you have a block design, your task is also going to have a lot of variance. But maybe an artifact has a lot of variance and much lower kappa, while a task-based component, even though it has a lot of variance, it also has a high kappa. So think about these type of things. You put it all together, and most of the times it works. It's going to look at the number of voxels that follow the linear trend versus not, how well they are compacted in space or not, a lot of things like that, and a long list that I'm not going to go through because some of them keep changing. And then it's going to kind of put all your components in 4 pockets, which the original version of the algorithm calls accepted, ignore, mid-K, or rejected. But at the end of the day, it's really 2 pockets, because the accepted and the ignore are kept in the data, and the mid-K and the rejected are regress out from the data. Accepted, very clear, the ones that we're very sure that they're good. Rejected, very clear, the ones that we're very sure they're bad. Ignore tend to be things that we're not very sure, but it's small variance, and therefore let's just keep them because they don't hurt that much. It's a small amount of the data. And mid-K seems to be things that are not very certain, but usually they tend to be bad. And I know this sounds very vague, and that's why you need to look at your results. I mean, it really does a good job. It really allows you to denoise the data in a more strict way than you would normally do, but you have to make sure that the algorithm doesn't do a small change in a very small component doesn't matter. But you don't want to see your task being thrown away or a huge drift being kept in when you can actually remove it, okay? Regarding the inputs and the outputs of the algorithm, well, the minimum you have to give to the algorithm is your fMRI data for the different echoes and the actual echoes at which that was acquired. So please write them down when you're at the scanner. But you can also, in the MICA package that Prantic distributed, it can also do the pre-processing for you, and then you need to provide other things like, the anatomical scans and a couple of extra parameters. In terms of the outputs, you get the static tissue star map that I defined at the beginning, a static S-node map. You get the optimally combined time series. You can try to do your analysis on those just to see. I mean, initially, those optimally combined time series should give you better result than just a single echo, because just that combination will give you bad signal in dropout regions and will also remove the Gaussian noise. It gives you the noise time series, which is basically the optimally combined after regressing out the rejected and the mid-K components. It gives you the spatial maps for the good components, for the bad components, and a lot of other things that will allow you to go into the results and understand whether things went well or not. So the MICA software, as far as I know, it's a little bit older version of it is available as you download AFNI. But if you want to get the latest versions, this is the website to go. Okay, well, there's some efforts in the last year to actually go through the code and clean it up and make it more understandable and modular. So you might be able one day to actually try maybe your own selection criteria and things like that. So for the latest versions, I would recommend going there. As I said, it's important to look at the results, and to help you with that, in our lab, we developed a reporting tool that basically will take these outputs from MICA and create a web-based report where you can see how much your TSNR improved before and after, and where you're going to be able to look at each of the components, see whether it was in which of the 4 groups it was given membership to, whether it was accepted or rejected, its kappa, its rho, its spatial map, and its spectrum and its time series. And this is something I recommend to do. And if you see any problems, I mean, initially there is no reason why you could then say, well, these components should have been removed, and you could actually remove it. And when you write your paper, so clearly that there was a mistake with one component, this is the component, and I'm removing it, and that shouldn't be a problem.
Just, I guess, on that point, so one of the things that they built in AFNI is a little bit changing the rejected components, or if a component is rejected, but you don't want it to have been rejected, is it possible to construct the denoise time series yourself from these different?
Yeah, initially, yes. I mean, the way you can run, I think it's 3D feeder. Again, I have to look, but basically you have your optimally combined data, which MICA gives you. Then you have on a text file the time series for all the components. You can select the time series of what are your back components and give it the same way you would give any other nuisance regressor, your motion, their first derivative, blah, 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 and do a single regression step where you take care of all of that, with the back components being the ones MICA gave you minus that one that you actually think that was a mistake. Personally, this is my opinion, I think that as long as you show what that component is and the reasons why you rejected it, I don't see a problem with that. Any more questions? So this is all I had regarding MICA. So now I'm going to move to this other algorithm that we've been developing lately that takes advantage of multi-echo data for a completely different purpose. So this is work on the making, and it's regarding the convolution. So what are the convolution methods, again, at a very high level for those of you who are not familiar with this? So the way we usually approach our fMRI data is that we have our data, we have details about the paradigm, we know the times at which, we saw them letters or music, whatever it is, and we pre-process our data, and we take advantage of having that information in order to generate our activity maps. Unfortunately, there might be scenarios where we don't have that detailed information about what was going on, and I don't know why this is running without me. What's going on the scanner at a given time. And that's where the convolution methods are going to help us, because what we're going to do in those cases is, just by having the data and a hemodynamic response model, basically how the hemodynamic response function to a given event of hopefully neuronal activation, we're going to be able to obtain maps of when and where in the brain events that led to a hemodynamic response model did happen. So basically the output, like here the output is an activation map, here the output is a video. in which you're gonna see at what moments in time and where there were events that led to hemodynamic responses that follow a canonical hemodynamic response set. Is that clear? So how do we do this? So we built on top of original formulations that are not for multi-echo. So we're gonna think that we have our activity-inducing signal that gets convolved with an hemodynamic response, and that will give us our expected Ball signal that we measure. Unfortunately, our scanners are not only sensitive to the Ball signal, but are sensitive to many other things. So what we tend to obtain always is a noisy measure of that. It contains the Ball signal and other things. And what the convolution methods are going to try to do is to estimate back the activity-inducing signal just by taking into account our noisy measurement and hemodynamic response model. Okay, because there is a lot of collinearity in this matrix. When you try to solve this system of equations, you have to impose some extra constraints. Otherwise, you cannot solve this. And one of the ways to do this is to actually impose this idea that events are sparse in time. Okay, this is an assumption. It holds true clearly for event-related. It might not hold true as perfectly for other things, but it's a way to start, okay? And you do that basically during using a regularization term here. I mean, what you're trying to do when you're trying to solve this deconvolution problem is to make sure that your estimated signal is as close as possible to your original signal, but also you're gonna say for very small things, just put them to 0 using an L1 term here. And this is been tested and used in the past, and it's available in AFNI as a program called 3D PFM. So what we did is to extend this to the multi-echo case. And basically the idea here is that you have a single activity-inducing signal that is convolved by the hemodynamic response, but that then it shows that linear dependence with the different echoes in your different recordings. Of course, there is noise, and here we think there are two types of noise, the Gaussian noise and the S-naught noise. Those are common across the different echoes. Here are our three, if we have 3 echoes, noise measures, and then we're gonna do the convolution with this method called multi-echo SPFN to try to estimate both the activity-inducing signal and the neck magnetization. If we were to put this in very compact matrix format, what we have here is, we have our unknowns that are the delta rho and the delta A, which is the activity-inducing signal, as in the previous case. In order to solve this, we're gonna have to impose some extra constraint or assumption. And we're gonna impose the assumption that both these two things are sparse in time, okay? We've also been playing with other models where we don't impose the sparsity on the delta rho, but just for today, let's go with this simple formulation. So what I'm gonna show you now is some results from an experiment in which we try to validate this, just to show you how it works and give you maybe a feeling of the type of results that you get. So in order to validate it, we had to do with a paradigm in which we knew what subjects were doing, otherwise we cannot validate it. And we decided to do a series of functional runs in which we have events for 5 different tasks. The idea here was to have tasks that would elicit activity in a different range of regions with different levels of activity. So we have auditory tasks, we have passive viewing of dot moving resembling biological motion, houses, motor tasks, and a reading task. And for each of these tasks, there are, I believe it's 6 events per run. Sorry about that. 6 events per run, and each of them lasts 4 seconds, and they're randomly distributed, okay? And for our analysis, we have multi-echo data. We run it through a pre-processing pipeline, and then we take the different echoes. So remember here, in order to enter the multi-echo SPFN algorithm, we don't use the optimally combined. This is a case in which we like to have the different echoes input the analysis. Sorry about that. Then we're gonna also take just the middle echo and run it through the original single echo formulation just to see whether we're doing better or not. Yes? Well, we tend, as I mentioned at the beginning, we tend to use the middle echo because usually we choose that echo to be very similar to what would be your echo time in regular single echo fMRI. If you have 4 or 5 echoes, then you would choose for comparison whatever is, yes, around 30 milliseconds, yeah. Then we're also gonna get activation maps for each of the different trials using an a GLM and giving this time the information about the different events. So this is for comparison purposes. Here we're going blind, either with single echo data or with multi-echo data. Here we're actually using the information. We're going to see how well we compare to that. So when you do your typical 3D deconvolve, you can either ask for a single map per each of the tasks. So we have 5 tasks, 6 events per task. You can either get just 5 maps for a given subject, 1 per task, or you can actually get 30 maps, 1 for each individual event of each task. Of course, those are going to be much noisier and less sensitive than this one. So we're going to compare with all of them just to see how well the algorithm performs. And then we're also going to do MICA on the multi-echo data, and we're going to take that single trace that MICA gives us and try it on these 3 cases just to see how well it compares, because maybe it might be the case that it's better to do MICA first and run the single echo version of the deconvolution algorithm than actually run the multi-echo deconvolution method. Okay, so let's look at some results. So here we have the 3 time series, preprocessed time series for a given voxels in a region that is part of the reading network. The vertical bands are the events for the reading events. What we can see is that, following each of these events, we seem to see this increase in the signal across the different echoes with hopefully that linear dependence that I've been describing. And of course, a lot of more other things are happening. We run our deconvolution method, and what we get are these sparse events. So the first thing is it's sparse, meaning you don't get these lambdas in every single time point. And the other important thing to see is that usually during each of the events, we see these negative lambdas. And they're supposed to be negative because this comes in units of delta R2 star. So negative change in delta R2 star, positive bold signal. And it seems the algorithm did pretty well because, it found some events here, here, nothing here. Well, I'll leave it here. There is one here, nothing here and here. So it seems, 5 out of 6, it got it right. But this is just one subject, okay? So here what we have is the activity map for the reading task for a given subject. This is using all the events from reading. This is the activation map you get. This is the GLM for each of the different events, and you can see that in most of the cases you get activation in this area, but much less sensitive than this one. This is the single echo version of the deconvolution method and the multi-echo. And the first thing you can see here is that this one seems to be much more sensitive than its single echo counterpart. We see negatives here because I just said negative or positive bold. But this is just one subject. So let's look at the group level. So what we're going to do to quantify these things in terms of sensitivity, specificity, and dice coefficient, which takes both into account, is to compare the results against the map at the task level when we take into account all the events of a given task. So what we can see here is that compared towards that, the sensitivity of looking at each individual event when you do GLM is very much compromised. It's much more compromised when you have a much more strict threshold. When we look at the single echo SPFM, we do much worse. But when suddenly we look at the multi-echo SPFM, it seems we have recovered. So we have a big boost in sensitivity by doing this, both compared to just using the middle echo or even doing MICA, which seems to improve a little bit. This bar seems a little bit higher, but nothing compared to using the new formulation that we proposed. In terms of specificity, it seems we get a little bit of a hit, meaning, we might get some voxels to activate that it shouldn't. But in truth is, when we look at the dice coefficient, there is a big boost in dice coefficient compared to the single echo formulation, and we nearly match what you would get using the trial by trial GLM. And again, keep in mind that to get this, I had to use the information about when things were happening. To do this, I just go completely blind into my data. And you can see that that's the case for any of the tasks, for the 5 different tasks. So it's not that you just get that for the motor cortex when you're doing a finger tapping. So this is some work that is in progress. We have we'll have a publication in the making and a couple of things in proceedings, but there are a lot of things that we're still evaluating. There are different models. As I say, you can think of having different assumptions about the sparsity, or you can do MICA first and then say, well, mostly I have taken care of all my delta S0 things, so I'm just going to model just the delta R2. But we think this is something that will allow you to, look at your data in a less constrained manner, and hopefully this is helpful for things like naturalistic stimuli, resting state, and even the study of interictal events in epilepsy. Here you just have a video. I mean, I don't know if I can stop. Well, here, basically, as I said, the results are a video. So here what you have is the stimuli as see what's going on. And here what you have is the estimation of R2 star and S naught. And so when houses appear, you tend to get, the events happening here on the fusiform gyros. For biological motion, you tend to get the blobs in MT, and it seems to work quite well. So conclusion, so hopefully I have convinced you that multi-echo fMRI allows you to capture additional information with minimal cost for you, and therefore it's something worth doing. Such additional information can be used to increase the CNR in dropout regions, can be used to automatically separate ball and non-ball components and therefore do automatic denoising with mica, and can help significantly increase the sensitivity of the convolution methods, as I just explained. In the particular case of mica, it's the combination of ICA with T-dependent analysis. That's the way to think about it, meaning that you could do something else that ICA to get the signals that are present in your data and then still do the T-dependence analysis. It will not clean every single artifact. This is just another, hopefully, better way to do the noising. But don't just think because you did mica, boom, my data is perfect. That's not the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a job anymore. Still under development, so there are new versions coming out. Please come talk to us. We'll try to explain everything we can about them. But definitely, I think it can substantially improve the quality of your data, and definitely it's something to consider, especially as we move more and more towards analyzing each single subject independently. This is just an example of how when you separate things, in a good case, you can really almost follow the fluctuation just by looking at the accepted components. And in the case of the deconvolution, I hope you will be willing to try this. As of now, the multi-echo version of the algorithm is not yet available in AVNI, but if somebody is willing to just jump into it, please contact me and we can talk about it. And I just want to thank all my colleagues and you guys for being here and listening. Thank you. Any questions? Questions?
Currently, we want to try the tie-dot method developed by
The
Rick.
what?
The tie-dot. So Tidana. So tie-dot is developed by Rick.
Yeah. So I mean, for the specifics of AVNI, of course, I would tell you to ask them. As far as I understand, what they're trying to do is to first make sure that should you run mica, you can incorporate that with your AVNI ProcPy pipeline of analysis. I don't know whether in the making there is also to actually build whole TET-ANA, themselves and potentially keep the same criteria for selection of components or adding other ones. But as of now, the way I think, even if you use AVNI ProcPy, you still need to download one version of mica, whether it's the one that comes with AVNI or one from the website that I put in there, and run it. But then, please add.
You have to repeat, but the title is the requesting matrix time series with augmentation.
Sorry?
That's just the regressing just the time series out.
Yeah, that's how AVNI ProcPy does it, yes. Yeah.
So I saw that you set the defaults for the kappa threshold and the row threshold. So, and then I also saw that they're defaulting to 10 and 1. How do you decide what a good default is?
The one that works. So initially, those are there just to try to help in cases where the ICA step doesn't converge. So initially, I wouldn't change the defaults. I would, if it doesn't converge, I would run a few times because it's non-deterministic. So you might run it once, it doesn't converge, and then you run it twice and it does. So I tend to run it 5-6 times. Then if it hasn't converged, then is when I would start playing with those. I wouldn't make the numbers too big. I think 15, I wouldn't go beyond that for, I think it's kappa though, that is 10. And the other one you might go to 5, but you have to be careful because that's gonna change the L1. Maybe it will converge, but then components won't be selected properly. But please add.
I think the K2 and RDR, those aren't thresholds, those are steps in the ICA.
It moves where the elbow end up. And when you move the elbow, then more or less things may end up on the ICA and the PCA, and that's why it may affect the convergence.
Another question I have is doing this run by run and how much data you really think one needs to collect in order to accurately.
So, I mean, it's a hard question to answer. In my experience, I would argue that you want your time series to at least have 200 data points. Again, it depends on the TR, many things, but I've seen it failing to converge when my time series are less than 150 very often. When my time series are longer than 200 data points, I seem to see that issue happening less. But it's not a perfect number. That Dan, you want to add to that, or?
I've had good luck with, if you have good quality data, I've had good luck with 150. If you're pushing it, then probably, like if you're trying to go high res, maybe 150. So
Yeah.
Better.
Anything else? Well, if you have more questions later, as I said, feel free to email us. And thank you.